When you hear about your organs, you probably think of your heart or your liver or your lungs, but your first associations with that term probably overlook your biggest organ. I'm talking about your skin. The glorious, fleshy shroud that keeps the world out and you in. Your skin protects your body against infection and extreme temperatures, maintains your balance of fluids, and even synthesizes vitamin D for your own personal use. Its many nerve endings allow you to sense the outside world, and its sweat glands and blood vessels help you maintain a proper temperature and communicate a whole range of stuff from your health to your emotions through things like blushing and flushing and sweating. It also accounts for about 3 to 5 kilograms of your body weight, and if you could spread it out, it would measure up to 2 square meters. It comes in lots of different colors. You can cover it up or show it off or tattoo the periodic table on it if you want. And of course, without it, you would basically shrivel up and die in no time. Together with your hair, nails, and sweat and oil glands, your skin forms your integumentary system. And if you've ever been burned or had surgery or stepped on a nail, you know how fast complications arise when it gets damaged. But it also heals up quite quickly. Layers. Like an everlasting gobstopper, the key to your integumentary system is layers. And although you can't tell by looking at it, your skin actually has 3 of them. The epidermis is the only layer you can actually see, assuming that your skin is intact, which is why it's what you think of when you think of skin. It's made of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. But the dermis just below it is where most of the work that skin does gets done, like sweating and circulating blood and feeling everything everywhere all the time. And at the bottom, there's the subcutis, or hypodermis, composed mostly of adipose or fatty tissue. Each of these layers owes its properties and its ability to do its skin job to its unique combination of cells. The bulk of your epidermis, for example, is made up of cells called keratinocytes, which are the building blocks of that tough, fibrous protein keratin that gives structure, durability, and waterproofing to your hair, nails, and outer skin. These cells are constantly dying and being replaced. You lose millions of them every day, enough to completely replace your epidermis every 4 to 6 weeks. The melanocyte, the spider-shaped cell that synthesizes melanin, the pigment that gives skin its color. I'll spend more time talking later about why skin color differs around the world, but one thing to keep in mind is that both the very palest and the very darkest human skins on the planet have about the same number of melanocytes. Your particular color isn't about the number of these cells that you have, but instead about the breadth of their spidery cellular extensions, which in turn affect the amount of melanin that they contain. But on a cellular level, we're all the same. Now, your skin, obviously, is also your first line of defense when it comes to protecting you from the outside world, so it may not come as a surprise that you have lots of immune system cells in your epidermis as well. These are your dendritic or Langerhans cells, which are kind of star-shaped, and like white blood cells and platelets, they actually originate in your bone marrow. Once they migrate to the epidermis, their long, skinny tendrils run around the keratinocytes and spend much of their time ingesting the unwanted invaders that are trying to sneak around your skin. Finally, rounding out the quartet of epidermal cells, your tactile, or Merkel cells, occur deep down at the boundary between the epidermis and the dermis, where they combine with nerve endings to create a sensory receptor for touch. What's a little weird, though, is that all of these cells are organized differently in the skin that covers your body. In fact, in some places, you have more layers of epidermis than others. Your thick skin, and yes, that's what it's really called, is the tougher stuff on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, and it consists of 5 epidermal layers. Your thin skin covers everything else with just 4. To get to know what's going on with your thick skin, let's just imagine you're walking around barefoot in the yard and suddenly you feel a shooting pain. You've just stepped on a big old nail and it's penetrated all of the layers of your epidermis. First, it pierced your stratum corneum, which means, pardon my Latin, horny layer. This is the outermost layer and also the roughest, made up of about 20 or 30 sheets of dead keratinocyte cells. This is the layer that you're always sloughing off and feeding to dust mites, but while it's in place, it offers basic protection from environmental threats. From there, the nail drives through your stratum lucidum, or clear layer. This holds 2 or 3 rows of clear, flat, dead keratinocytes that are only found in the thick skin of your palms and foot soles. So in places where you only have thin skin, this layer is what's missing. Things start to get more serious in the granular layer, or stratum granulosum, because this contains living keratinocytes that are forming keratin like crazy. This layer looks kind of grainy because those cells are getting compressed and flattened as they move up through the epidermal layers, maturing as they go. The deeper you go through the layers of the epidermis, the younger the cells get. Regeneration happens in the lower layers, and new cells move up toward the surface, maturing along the way, where they eventually die and slough off from the surface of your skin. This whole process is due in part to the fact that the epidermis is epithelial, so it's avascular. That means that all the oxygen and nutrients that its cells need have to come from the dermis below it. So as epidermal cells mature and get bumped up by younger cells forming below them, they move further and further from the blood supply and end up essentially suffocating. When that nail cuts through the fourth layer, the stratum spinosum, or spiny layer, it's getting closer to the point where cell regeneration or mitosis is active. These cells look prickly when they're dehydrated from microscope slide preparation, hence the name, and that's because they contain filaments that help them hold to each other. And finally, that dang nail touches down on your deepest, thinnest epidermal level, the basal layer, or stratum basale. It's just a single layer of columnar cells, but it's like a cell factory where most of that new cell production happens. This stratum is also what connects the epidermis to the layer of skin below it, the dermis. Feeling a little overwhelmed by all the layers? Just remember, come, let's get sunburned. It's a mnemonic. I mean though, who came up with that? Because if you own some skin, you know you don't want to get sunburned. The ultraviolet radiation in the sun can damage the epidermis, causing elastic fibers to clump up, leading to that telltale leatherface condition. Plus, getting sunburned temporarily depresses your immune system, because remember, you have immune cells in your epidermis too, and the radiation can actually alter your skin cells' DNA. Well, skin damage of any kind can get serious when it affects the dermis, because it's not only got loads of those collagen and elastin fibers which help make your skin strong and elastic, it's also full of capillaries and blood vessels. And it houses the nerve fibers that register sensations like temperature, pressure, and pain, as well as parts of your hair follicles and oil and sweat glands with the ducts that lead up to the surface of the skin. So the dermis is where most of the skin's work is done, and it does it in just 3 layers. The upper papillary layer is composed of a thin sheet of areolar connective tissue that's riddled with little peg-like projections called dermal papillae. These papillae are pretty neat because in the thick skin of your hands and feet, these tiny protrusions form unique friction ridges that press up through the epidermis to help our fingers and feet grip surfaces. Your fingerprints. Just below that papillary layer is the deeper, thicker reticular layer that makes up 80% of your dermis, made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. All of the dynamic parts contained within the dermis, like the nerve fibers and capillaries, are distributed between both its layers. So anytime you get cut enough to bleed or feel pain, you know that you've broken through the epidermis and lacerated the dermis. Finally, something of a footnote to your skin is its third and most basal layer, the subcutis or hypodermis. It consists of mostly adipose connective tissue, basically a seam of fat, and it provides insulation, energy storage, shock absorption, and helps anchor the skin. In short, your hypodermis is where most of your body fat hangs out. This collection of resilient tissues, ranging from the sharp and hard to the soft and fluffy, serve a whole panoply of functions, the majority of which you never even notice. But when you do notice what your integumentary system is doing, the results are often uncomfortable, or ugly, or both. And that is what this stuff is mostly for. Your sweat glands can make you smell, your oil glands can give you zits, your skin can become either scaly or greasy, and in rare cases it can even change color. And hair, well, let's just say it takes a lot of science to tame this mane. But each of these tissues, frustrating as they may be at times, has a purpose, and without them you'd be cold and vulnerable and dead. I'm not going to lecture you on personal hygiene today, but hopefully by the end of this you'll understand the important functions of your integumentary system, and maybe why it's worth a little bit of time and effort to keep it healthy. The first and most vital purpose of your integumentary system is to act as a protective barrier. Your skin, hair, nails, and sweat and oil glands all work together to shield you from all the things out there that are out to get you. Excessive sunlight, infections, abrasions, and just, getting poked by sharp sticks and stuff. But beyond that, this system is also vital to how you sense the world around you. Your skin is loaded with structures that are actually part of your nervous system, called cutaneous sensory receptors. They're what receive stimuli from the outside environment and send them to your brain. These receptors, or corpuscles as they're sometimes called, register all of the different sensations that you associate with touch. Your tactile corpuscles, for instance, are what make you constantly aware of the tag that's scratched into the back of your neck, while your lamellar corpuscles register the sense of pressure, like when someone puts their hand on your shoulder. Your hair follicles have receptors too, which is why you can feel a slight breeze on your skin or through your hair. Now, on the less sexy front, your integumentary system also plays a role in the excretion of waste, though not as big as a role as we're often led to believe. Most nitrogen-containing wastes like urea, uric acid, and ammonia are disposed of through your urine, but small amounts are eliminated through your skin in sweat. But despite what you may be told at the beginning of your hot yoga class, there isn't much evidence that suggests that heavy sweating actually rids your body of any extra toxins. But despite what you may be told at the beginning of your hot yoga class, there isn't much evidence that suggests that heavy sweating actually rids your body of any extra toxins. If anything, you're just losing losing more water. When you do exercise, though, you call on another of your skin's lesser-known functions as a handy blood storage unit. About 5% of your entire blood volume is retained in your skin at any given time, and when you suddenly need more blood supplied to your organs, like when you're working out, your nervous system constricts your dermal blood vessels to squeeze that extra blood into circulation. Now, during these times of exertion, both your blood and your sweat glands work together to perform a key function, regulating your body temperature. Even without exercise, your body oozes out about half a liter of sweat per day in an effort to keep you at a comfortable temperature. That's just your normal, barely noticeable sweat called insensible perspiration. But on a hot day, or if you're on the dance floor exerting yourself, that sweat becomes much more noticeable. Such sensible perspiration could produce as much as 12 liters of sweat per day. Now, if the temperature gets chilly, the surface of your skin can lose a lot of heat because it has so much warm blood behind it. To regulate that heat loss, your dermal blood vessels constrict, causing your blood to head deeper into your tissues and help keep your vital organs warm. Once things warm up, those blood vessels in the skin gradually relax and allow that blood to return to the surface. You've probably noticed that if you're cold for too long, your skin may lose some of its color, or even turn pale blue if you're light-skinned, as that blood retreats from the surface. And in fact, like a litmus test for your body, changes in the color of your skin can indicate a number of homeostatic imbalances. Blue skin, or cyanosis, in Caucasian people may indicate heart failure, poor circulation, or severe respiratory issues. That's because blood that's been depleted of oxygen turns darker in color, and when seen through the tissue of lips or skin, it can look bluish. A yellowing of the skin, called jaundice, usually signifies liver disorder, as yellow bile starts accumulating in the bloodstream. Reddened skin, or erythema, could indicate a fever, inflammation, or allergy. All of these conditions cause blood vessels to expand and more blood to flow to the skin's surface. Of course, human skin color spans a pretty wide spectrum, so some of these conditions are easier to diagnose by looking for discolorations of other tissues, like mucous membranes and the beds of finger and toenails. However light or dark your skin color is, though, you can thank your melanin for it. You remember that melanin is a pigment produced by the melanocyte cells in your epidermis. Melanin has two forms, producing pigments that range in color from reddish yellow to brownish black. Because its main job is to protect us from the sun's ultraviolet rays, it makes sense that in the distant past the distribution of these different skin tones was not at all random. Historically, where solar radiation is more intense, higher concentrations of deep-colored melanin became an advantage for the protection it provided. But closer to the poles, where the solar rays are weaker and more diffuse, lower concentrations of melanin allowed people to collect what sunlight was available to manufacture vitamin D. Because the fact is, we all need some level of sunlight to hit our skin to survive. Your bones require vitamin D to keep producing new bone cells, and it's the only vitamin that your body can actually produce on its own. Your skin cells contain a molecule that converts to vitamin D when it comes in contact with UV light. From there, the vitamin heads through your bloodstream to your liver and kidneys, where it truly becomes activated D, also called calcitriol, which is circulated to all the bones of your body. Let's not just be skin deep here. Your integumentary system also involves your so-called skin appendages, your hair, nails, sweat, and sebaceous or oil glands, which can each be fascinating as well as frustrating in its own way. If you're like some people I know and you spend a fortune on hair conditioner, that's because your cuticles are out of control. All your hairs, or pili, are basically just flexible strands of dead keratin protein cells, like your fingernails. And the outermost layer of these dead cells, called the cuticle, looks like it's made of overlapping roof shingles. So what you're paying the conditioner to do is even out the rough surface between those cells of the cuticle to make it look smooth. Now, if you pluck out a strand of your hair, you will be in pain, but you will also have the opportunity to notice that it has two main regions: the shaft, where the keratinization is complete, and the root, the part inside the follicle where the keratinization is still happening. Each follicle is just a tube of epidermal cells, and just like in your epidermis, the cells at the bottom of each follicle are young and fresh, continually dividing and pushing older cells up through the skin and into the open air. And your finger and toenails pretty much grow the same way, starting at the back of the nail bed, where the new cells divide at the root and get pushed forward, creating the scaly, hard keratin that you paint with polish and keep trimmed during flip-flop season. But there's probably no other part of the integumentary system that you spend more money on trying to control than your sweat and oil glands. You've got up to 3 million tiny sudoriferous or sweat glands distributed throughout your body. These guys secrete your salty, watery sweat, and they come in two types: eccrine and apocrine. Your eccrine sweat glands are more abundant. They're in your palms, forehead, and in the soles of your feet. They're just simple coiled tubes that start at the dermis, extend through a duct, and open into a pore on the surface of your skin. Your apocrine sweat glands are a slightly different story. You only have about 2,000 of these, and they start cooking around puberty, emptying into the hair follicles around your armpits and groin. These glands secrete a kind of deluxe sweat with fats and proteins in it. It's more viscous and sometimes yellowish in color. When bacteria on the skin get a hold of this sweat, it gets odorific, creating what we generally call body odor. Deodorants don't affect how much you sweat, but they do reduce those smells by attacking the stink-making bacteria, while antiperspirants do the opposite, using ingredients like aluminum to block your sweat glands and actually keep you from perspiring. Some researchers believe these glands may be the human equivalent of other animals' musky sex scent glands. So while you might not want to stink up a whole room, a little bit of body odor might actually get you a mate. Mammary glands, which secrete milk in lactating people, and ceruminous glands, the ones that make your cerumen or earwax, are two other types of modified apocrine sweat glands. Finally, your sebaceous or oil glands are found everywhere but the thick skin in your palms and foot soles. Their ducts are smaller on your limbs, but they're pretty big on your face and neck and upper chest. Most of your sebaceous glands secrete their sebum, an oily substance, into hair follicles where it can travel to the surface of your skin. And while yes, they cause wicked pimples, their primary goal is to soften and lubricate your skin and hair, and help slow water loss from the skin in dry environments.
A body has between 2 and 4 million sweat glands lying deep in the skin. They are connected to the surface by coiled tubes called ducts. You perspire constantly, even without exercise. Sweat is a liquid made from 99% water and 1% salt and fat. Up to a quart of sweat evaporates each day. When your body becomes overheated, you sweat more. The evaporation of sweat from your skin cools your body down.
This model shows sweat glands, or sudoriferous glands, and you can see 4 of them represented in different regions. We have one over here in the scalp, one over here in the armpit, and it's next to another type of sweat gland, and then 2 that are located right over here in the sole of the foot. This one over here and this one over here is in relief, and these 2 have been cut open so that you can see profiles. Here you can see these 2 sweat glands. These are the most common type of sweat gland. This is the eccrine sweat gland. It produces a very watery secretion. You can see that the secretory part of the gland is right over here where this tube is highly coiled, and the secretions will be dumped into a duct which will ascend, and you can see it coiling through the thick epidermis that you find in the sole of the foot and opening up at the surface at a pore. Right next to this eccrine sweat gland, we see this sweat gland, which is referred to as the apocrine sweat gland. We take a closer look at the secretory portion of this apocrine sweat gland. The secretory portion has a wider lumen, and because of the way these cells appeared histologically, it was thought that these cells were secreting their secretion by the apocrine method of secretion, which is the way that the glands in the breasts, the lactiferous glands, produce milk. However, that was a mistake because the actual method of secretion of this gland is similar to the way sweat is produced in the eccrine sweat gland. The secretion that is produced is a thicker, more viscous secretion, and it contains a lot of molecules that, when bacteria start to work on these molecules and break them down, it produces body odor, and for this reason you can think of this sweat gland as being the stinky sweat gland. You can see its duct going up and opening up through a pore right over here. We can see right over here in the skin of the scalp and right over here in the skin of the armpit, associated with the hair follicles, we can see the sebaceous or oil glands. So here we can see the oil gland in three-dimensional relief, and here we can see it in 3 dimensions and cut open right over here. This oil gland dumps its secretion right over here into the hair follicle, right where the internal root sheath disintegrates.
And now we have 3 types of glands that exist in our skin. They're called the holocrine gland, there's the apocrine gland, and finally the merocrine gland. So I'll kind of compare and contrast them here. The first thing to realize is that the way we name these types of glands indicate how they release their secretions. The holocrine gland releases its secretions by disintegrating the whole cell. So the entire cell breaks down to release what's called sebum. Sebum. And so another name for holocrine glands are sebaceous glands. Sebaceous because they release sebum. Now, apocrine glands release secretions from the apex of the cell, or the top of the cell breaks off. So the top of your cell breaks off to release a mixture of proteins, lipids, and steroids. So proteins, lipids, and steroids. So a whole bunch of things right here. And finally, merocrine secretion or merocrine glands release their secretions, which is mostly the watery sweat we think of. These are the main sweat glands we talk about. They release watery sweat by a process you may be familiar with. It's called exocytosis. That's the budding off of the cell membrane with contents from inside the cell, which in this case would just be watery, salty contents that would be sweat. Now let's get a little more room right here and talk about where each of these types of sweat glands are found. Holocrine sweat glands are found on the face, the chest, and the back. The face, the chest, and the back. It looks like I didn't write it here, but I want to make sure you know that sebum is mostly an oily substance, so it's more lipid concentrated than, say, something like your apocrine secretion, so it's very oily. And now your apocrine glands are mostly concentrated in your armpits, the groin, and around the nipples. The armpits, the groin, and around the nipples. And the main thing here that's unique about the apocrine sweat glands is that they release their contents into the hair follicle. So they release their contents into the hair follicle, which is unique from the other types of sweat glands we're talking about. And then finally, our merocrine glands, which are our bread and butter sweat glands, are found literally everywhere else in the body, and they're mostly concentrated in our palms of our hands, like with this guy up here, palms in our hands, and even the soles of our feet, our palms and our soles. And then finally, what are the functions of these 3 types of glands? Well, for our holocrine or our sebaceous glands, this oily or lipid-rich sebum is meant to lubricate the skin, so it lubricates our skin, and in doing so, that also slows bacterial growth. So it slows bacterial growth by making it difficult for bacteria to move around and divide. So slows bacteria growth. Now for apocrine glands, the interesting thing about them is that they don't even really begin to release secretions until after puberty hits. Till after puberty. And the reason why could be better understood when we talk about animals, because apocrine glands in animals release things like pheromones and warning signals and even territorial marking signs that we don't really practice as human beings. So the interesting thing about apocrine glands is that they're involved in what's called emotional sweating. Emotional sweating. And they're an ongoing topic of research. Emotional sweating, meaning that these glands are most active during times of great anxiety, stress, fear, and even pain. And finally, our merocrine glands are actually, I'd say, our most important glands because they help us cool down through evaporative cooling. We talk about that in a separate video. So they help us cool down with our sweat. They help us eliminate waste products as well. So any extra nitrogenous waste products that we might have, or water or electrolytes we don't need, we release through our merocrine glands in our sweat. And finally, merocrine glands also release things like lysozymes, which are enzymes that lyse bacteria, and even antibodies, which are immunologic proteins, so antibodies that'll help tag bacteria and other foreign pathogens or bad stuff that could cause damage to our skin and our bodies, tag these things for elimination. So your sweat is far more important than just cooling you down. It even helps your livelihood, in addition to all the other things we talked about here. So there's a lot going on when we talk about our glands and the rest of the appendages we've appreciated here.
Sweat glands are also called sudoriferous glands, and all skin surfaces except for the nipples and external genitalia contain sweat glands. In fact, you get about 3 million of these per person, and there are two major types of sudoriferous or sweat glands. We got the eccrine or merocrine sweat glands, and they're named this because they use a merocrine form of secretion, and then apocrine sweat glands are also another variety. Now, these contain myoepithelial cells, which contract on nervous system stimulation to force sweat into the ducts and onto the skin surface. And the merocrine sweat glands, also called eccrine, these are the most numerous. You find these on your palms, soles of your feet, and forehead most abundantly. These ducts connect to pores on the surface of your skin, and these are mostly involved with thermoregulation. Thermoregulation meaning that we can actually cool our body temperature down by sweating and relying on the evaporative cooling properties of water. And it's actually regulated by your sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight response. So if you're excited, then you're going to sweat, and this is going to help to cool your body down. Now, the secretion of sweat is mostly water, followed by salts, some vitamin C, antibodies, which is actually an immune element, dermacidin, which is a microbe-killing peptide, as well as other metabolic wastes. So some wastes are also incorporated into sweat, and you find that in conditions like renal failure, where if your kidneys can't get rid of wastes, your sweat glands actually end up secreting a lot of these wastes, and you end up with something called uremic frost, which is essentially kind of a salty coating of the skin due to an accumulation of these wastes now in sweat rather than urine. So what do these eccrine sweat glands look like? Well, essentially there's these tubular glands that are highly coiled. You find them embedded within the dermis, and then those drain into a duct, which then winds up and then empties on the surface of your skin through a sweat pore. So that sweat is essentially drained onto the surface of skin via this duct. Now remember, the way that sweat actually gets up onto the surface of skin are those myoepithelial cells, because the myoepithelial cells would surround the ducts and then essentially help to squeeze that fluid up and out of the duct towards the skin surface. Now, this differs from the apocrine sweat glands. Apocrine sweat glands are confined to the axillary and anogenital areas. When you think of anogenital, think of like perineum, which is essentially the space between the external genitalia and the anus. Now, apocrine sweat glands secrete a more viscous, milky, or yellowish type of sweat that contains fatty substances and proteins. Now, this is the one these aren't as active until puberty, and their function is really unknown, but they probably act as a sexual scent gland because these viscous, milky substances that have a lot of protein could be pheromones that are involved with, sexual communication through pheromonal communication. It turns out that the bacteria on your skin also like to break down and digest these substances in sweat, and this is what leads to body odor. So body odor in the axillary, which is the armpit, or anogenital areas, groin, this is associated with bacteria eating apocrine secretions, and the metabolites of those bacteria are what cause body odor. Now, these apocrine sweat glands are much larger than the eccrine sweat glands, and their ducts empty on the hair follicles rather than on the surface of skin. So you only find apocrine sweat glands associated with hair, specifically the hair of your axillary and anogenital areas. These aren't really involved with thermoregulation. They're most likely involved with sexual scent, pheromonal communication. Now, there are other modified sweat glands as well, like ceruminous glands or mammary glands. Ceruminous glands are the ones that line your external ear canal, and they secrete cerumen, which is basically earwax. And mammary glands are also a modified type of apocrine secretion, and this is what creates breast milk. So what's fascinating is that these are just similar varieties of apocrine glands in different areas of the body. Now, oil glands are the ones that are associated with the hair follicle. They're widely distributed except for the thick skin of your palms and soles. Now, these sebaceous or oil glands are associated with hair follicles, and they're relatively inactive during puberty, therefore stimulated by hormones, especially androgens. And the type of oil that these create is actually called sebum. Sebum is this oily holocrine type of secretion. Remember, the entire cell bursts to become the secretion here. And it also contains bactericidal or bacteria-killing properties, and it helps to soften hair and skin. So in that sense, that sebaceous glands help to condition your skin. So you find sebaceous glands associated with hair follicles, as we can see here. In fact, the duct of these sebaceous glands drains right onto the hair shaft, or the hair root rather, and that way the growing hair brings oil up to the surface of skin with it, and it makes sure that the hair is conditioned and your skin is well conditioned.
What are electrolytes? Electrolytes are ionic minerals, which mean that they are minerals that have a positive or negative electrical charge. The three main electrolyte minerals are sodium, potassium, and chloride. Sodium helps regulate blood pressure and aid in nerve impulses and muscle contractions. Potassium helps regulate heartbeat, muscle and nerve cell functions, and helps maintain a healthy blood pH level. Chloride's main function is to help with fluid balance in the body. Your kidneys, along with several hormones, regulate electrolyte levels. Electrolytes are lost through sweat, urine, and feces. For people exercising more than 60 minutes, electrolyte loss can sometimes be a concern. However, in most people, electrolyte deficiency is rare. Many sports drinks are high in electrolytes, but they usually contain large amounts of added sugar or artificial sweeteners. A great way to replenish electrolytes is by consuming them through foods. Bananas, spinach, and avocados are high in potassium. Sodium and chloride, or salt, is added to many foods such as sauces and soups, making their replenishment easy to achieve.
An electrolyte conducts electricity. Okay, so it conducts electricity. For the electrolyte and the non-electrolyte, well, obviously since it's a non-electrolyte, it does not conduct electricity. An electrolyte essentially is a compound that dissolves, forming ions. So what we can do here is we can do this and kind of divide them in two, and essentially the electrolyte is going to be a compound that dissolves into ions that then allow for electrons to flow freely, allowing it to conduct the electricity. The non-electrolyte is a compound that does not dissolve. Into ions. Therefore, if there are no ions, electrons are not able to flow freely in this solution because it's not an ionic solution. Therefore, there's no electricity that's going to take place, no conduction of electricity.
The fluids in your body are composed of water and dissolved substances, including electrolytes, which are crucial for body function. We ingest water and electrolytes through the gastrointestinal tract. Fluids are absorbed into the plasma in the intestine. The fluids circulate within the plasma, bathing the cells in the body. The kidneys remove excess ions and water from the body through the urine, although water is also lost at other sites. Water performs several important functions in the body. Water helps maintain body temperature. When water vaporizes off the skin, it takes large quantities of heat with it. This process cools the body temperature down. Because water has a high heat capacity, it can absorb and release large quantities of heat before significantly changing temperature. Our bodies are composed of 50 to 70% water, and that large percentage of water holds heat in the body and helps prevent fluctuation in body temperature. Water is the reactant for hydrolysis reactions that occur in the body. Starch is hydrolyzed in the mouth by the enzyme salivary amylase. With the help of this enzyme, water molecules are added to the bonds between the glucose units in the starch, hydrolyzing the starch to glucose. Water acts as a solvent to dissolve molecules and ions in the body. For example, if you eat a salty pretzel, the water in your saliva will dissolve the salt. Water is a polar molecule. When water dissolves ions, the partial negative charge on the oxygen attracts positive ions, such as sodium, and the partial positive charge on the hydrogen attracts negative ions, such as chloride. Except for the salts deposited in bone and teeth, most other ions in the body are dissolved because of water's ability to act as a solvent. Water within cells is an important solvent. It dissolves many of the proteins and other solutes. We are now looking at a blood vessel. Because of water's ability to dissolve ions and molecules within the body fluids, water functions as a medium for the delivery of nutrients and the removal of wastes from the cells through the plasma. Water, along with its dissolved solutes, occupies three main compartments within the body. Intracellular fluid is the fluid within cells. It is also known as cytosol. Extracellular fluid is the fluid found outside of cells. There are two major kinds of extracellular fluid. Interstitial fluid is the fluid surrounding the cells. Plasma is the fluid component of the blood. Let's consider a 70-kilogram man. 60% of his weight, or approximately 40 liters, is fluid. Approximately 62% of the body's fluid is intracellular. Approximately 40% of the body's fluid is interstitial. Approximately 8% of the body's fluid is blood plasma. You are looking at plasma, a typical body fluid. The term body fluid refers to the water in the body and all of the dissolved substances, which are also known as solutes. Since the water dissolves the solutes, it is the solvent. A typical body fluid contains electrolytes, also known as ions. Proteins are considered to be colloids when dispersed in body fluids. Compared to simple ions, proteins are huge molecules. Because they bear a negative charge, we will consider them to be electrolytes. Non-electrolytes are uncharged molecules found in body fluids. Glucose is an example of a non-electrolyte. Blood cells do not dissolve in water. They are suspended particles and are not considered to be a part of the body fluid. Electrolytes are charged particles or ions that are dissolved in body fluids. The major positive ions or cations in body fluids are sodium ion, potassium ion, calcium ion, and magnesium ion. The major negative ions or anions in body fluids are chloride ion, bicarbonate ion, phosphate ions, sulfate ion, anions of organic acids such as lactate, and proteins. Each fluid compartment needs just the right types and levels of electrolytes for proper functioning of neurons, muscle cells, and other cells in the body. The electrolyte composition of extracellular fluids and intracellular fluids have significant differences. Filling in the pie graph will help illustrate these differences. Extracellular fluid also contains other positive ions: potassium, calcium, and magnesium. Intracellular fluid also contains other positive ions: sodium and magnesium. Other negative ions found in the extracellular fluid are protein, bicarbonate, phosphates, organic acids, and sulfate. Other negative ions found in the intracellular fluid are bicarbonate, chloride, and sulfate. The composition of interstitial fluid is almost identical to that of plasma, except for one negative electrolyte. Now let's look at a few of the many important functions that electrolytes perform in the body. Electrolytes serve as cofactors for enzymes. A very important reaction in the body occurs when carbon dioxide and water form carbonic acid. We can speed up this reaction with the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Cofactors are non-protein substances that act, along with enzymes, to speed up reactions in the body. Calcium, magnesium, and other cations, such as zinc, can serve as cofactors for enzymes. Zinc is a cofactor for this enzyme. Electrolytes in the form of sodium and potassium ions also contribute to membrane potential in all cells and are responsible for action potentials in neuron and muscle cells. Calcium ions are important electrolytes because they are involved in the secretion and action of hormones and neurotransmitters. Calcium is also involved in the contraction of muscles, including the heart. Some electrolytes, such as bicarbonate, phosphate, and protein, help maintain acid-base balance. By pumping sodium out the cell, the sodium-potassium pump uses ATP to keep the concentration of sodium low inside cells.
So fluids and electrolytes, okay. Whenever we're talking about this, what we need to understand is that there are three main compartments, okay? The first one is your intracellular fluid. The second one, extracellular fluid. And the third one is your third spaces. How do we get fluid into our bodies, okay? The main way, you think about drinking water. You get water in and it gets absorbed through your digestive tract, primarily in the large intestine. You can also get it intravenously. If you have to have an IV started and get fluids pushed, a bolus or whatever, that's another mechanism, a route by which you get fluid into your body. And then the ways that you get rid of fluid, your renal system, the urinary system, you excrete it through urine. You also get rid of fluid through defecation, feces. You get rid of fluid through diaphoresis, through sweating, and also through your respiratory tract. By exhaling, you lose a minute amount, but it is still an amount of fluid. And this is a key thing you need to know, whatever amount of fluid you put into your body, you need to be putting that out. That is homeostasis. Now, speaking of homeostasis, that's the big key too, guys. You really need to know that. You need to understand that this is how things are supposed to operate at a homeostatic level. Let's talk about the electrolytes very briefly. Some of your major electrolytes that you really need to be concerned with is your sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, phosphate, calcium, hydrogen ions, bicarbonate, all of these things. It's like a well orchestrated symphony, right? They are all placed within intra and extracellular fluid in such perfect amounts that homeostasis is maintained and the body functions as it should. But what I want to do is I want to take a couple seconds and demonstrate to you guys an example of what happens whenever things do not function properly. But what happens whenever homeostasis is not maintained, whenever there's a pathology or something of that sort and homeostasis is disrupted. That's why it's really important to understand fluid and electrolytes and their importance in the body. So what I want to do is I want to give you guys a quick little example, and hopefully this is going to help you understand fluid and electrolytes a little bit better. So let's talk about sodium. Sodium is primarily in your extracellular fluid. So what you need to understand here is there is a certain level of sodium within your blood that is normal. The normal range is 135 to 145. So here's how I want to demonstrate this for you guys. Here, this is your blood. Here, this is your sodium. Now look what I'm doing. Bam, okay? The amount of sodium, let's say hypothetically, the amount of sodium that I just put in here is your normal range. You are between 135 and 145. Perfect. That's where you want to be. Your body's loving you right now. What happens if too much sodium gets put into your blood? This is what is referred to as hypernatremia. You have too much sodium in your blood, and that is problematic. So this is why it's good to use this glass of water to conceptualize this. How do you cure this problem? What you're really looking at is there is too great of a concentration of sodium in your blood. How do you cure it? How would you dilute this amount of sodium to get that sodium level back between 135 and 145? You would add more water. Increase your oral intake of fluids to dilute the sodium in the blood and get that back into that homeostatic 135 to 145 range. But let's say we accidentally went a little bit too far, right? And we have too much fluid in here, right? And our patient is now hyponatremic. There is too little sodium in the blood, okay? Because we have too much fluid, we are over diluted, okay? This is just the way that you could think about it to help conceptualize it. You are now over diluted. Too much water, too little sodium. So how do we go about reversing this, okay? Well, what you could think of is, yes, you could have some sort of a sodium replacement to increase your sodium levels, but what I have heard and found to be gold standard treatment from physicians is they will place a fluid restriction, because you really want the kidneys and all of those mechanisms by which fluid escapes the body. You want those to keep flushing the fluid out of the body while restricting the amount that you put in. That's one way that you could do it. And you could also see a physician possibly order a diuretic of some sort to flush additional fluid out of the body and retain the sodium, so that way you get back between that nice 135 and 145 homeostatic range.
Water is essential for human life. It's why human civilizations historically sprouted up along the banks of rivers, lakes, and oceans. Water is the main substance in our bodies, making up more than 50% of a person's body weight, and it's directly involved in every biochemical reaction in each cell in our body. Ultimately, maintaining the right balance of water is what keeps us alive. Water is a V-shaped molecule made up of two hydrogen atoms that bind to a single oxygen atom, and it's commonly referred to by its chemical composition of H2O. The bond between hydrogen and oxygen is a way of representing the fact that the two atoms share a single electron that zips around in the space between them. The space where it moves around is called an electron cloud, and it's a bit lopsided, since the sharing isn't completely balanced. That's because the oxygen is more electronegative, which means it pulls the electron closer. Because the electron spends a bit more time on the side nearest the oxygen has a partial negative charge, and the hydrogens have a partial positive charge. That's called a dipole, with the hydrogen end of the bond having a slight positive charge and the oxygen end having a slight negative charge. In fact, it's this dipole that really explains the magic of water, because it allows the slightly positive hydrogens to line up with slightly negative oxygen atoms from other water molecules. That attraction between water molecules is called a hydrogen bond, and ultimately, it's the reason that water molecules huddle up together. Think about the dew droplets that form on leaves early in the morning. That bead is huddled up because of millions of hydrogen bonds within it. Also, having lots of slightly positive hydrogens and slightly negative oxygens is what allows water to be a great solvent for other molecules like sugar and salt, which can easily dissolve into it. Total body water can be subdivided into two major compartments: intracellular fluid, which is fluid inside cells, and extracellular fluid, which is fluid outside of cells, like in the blood and in the interstitial tissues between cells. Let's say that a person's total water makes up 60% of their body weight. 2/3 of that 60%, or 40% of body weight, is intracellular fluid, and the other third, or 20% of body weight, is extracellular. Both inside and outside the cells, water acts as a solvent for electrically charged molecules called ions, or electrolytes. When water dissolves electrolytes, the slightly negatively charged oxygen attracts positive ions like sodium, and the slightly positively charged hydrogen attracts negative ions like chloride. That's how table salt, or NaCl, dissolves into water. In our bodies, the main positive electrolytes are sodium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, and the main negative electrolytes are chlorine, bicarbonate, phosphate, and sulfate. These are kept at very specific concentrations both within and outside of the cell, through a variety of processes. One mechanism is osmosis, where water moves from the more dilute compartment, or one with low concentration, to the more concentrated compartment. So blood osmolarity, which is the overall concentration of all substances dissolved in the blood, like electrolytes, glucose, and urea, is a good measure of hydration status, and it's normally around 300 milliosmoles per liter. When blood osmolarity is high, a common reason is that there's not enough water in the body, like in dehydration. When blood osmolarity is low, a common reason is that there's too much water, like when it's being retained by the kidneys. Normally, the amount of total body water is balanced through ingestion and elimination of water, ins and outs. About 80% of our water intake comes from drinking fluids. The other 20% comes from food. Water content in food varies, but some fruits and vegetables, like watermelon or strawberries, are 90% water by weight. As far as water output goes, we eliminate water through breathing, as humidified air leaves the body, as well as through sweating, urinating, and with bowel movements. In addition to the water we get from foods, the recommended daily amount of fluid intake for women is around 9 glasses of water, or 2.2 liters, and for men, it's about 13 glasses, or 3 liters. But as we'll soon see, the amount of water needed per day can vary depending on many different factors. Plain water is the ideal choice when it comes to hydration, but all fluids, including caffeinated drinks like coffee and tea or flavored waters and juices, contribute to water intake. After we drink water, it travels all the way through our digestive tract until it reaches the small and large intestines, where water is absorbed into the bloodstream. When we're at rest, each heartbeat propels around 25% of our blood to the kidneys, where millions of nephrons filter it to produce urine. When we're properly hydrated, the kidneys produce between 800 and 2,000 milliliters of urine every day, and the urine has a pale yellow shade. But some water, around 200 milliliters per day, is also lost during bowel movements. Sweat glands in the skin produce small amounts of sweat, and their production increases when we're nervous, when it's hot outside, or during exercise. The amount of sweat we lose each day varies quite a lot based on the level of activity in the person, so let's say on average it's 500 to 700 milliliters per day, even though some athletes can sweat more than a liter in an hour when it's really hot. Finally, there's the insensible water losses. They're called insensible because we're not aware of them. When we breathe in, water inside our body is able to humidify the air, and that water vapor is then lost when we breathe out. Water also constantly diffuses through the layers of our skin, keeping them elastic and nourished, but also evaporating at the skin's surface. This is in addition to losing water through our sweat glands. All in all, insensible losses account for an incredible 600 to 900 milliliters per day, which is a lot of water to lose without even really sensing it. I don't want to shock you again, but staying hydrated is important because water does so many important things in the body. Water makes up tears, mucus, saliva, and other secretions that protect or lubricate passageways in and out of the body, like the eyes, nose, mouth, and genitals. Lubrication is also important in the pleural and pericardial cavities in the chest, and the peritoneal cavity in the abdomen, where internal organs touch and slide over one another. It's also needed at the joints, where it helps form synovial fluid that keeps our bones from rubbing against one another. And water is critical for digestion. The water in saliva moistens food when we chew, while gastric and intestinal juices are a fluid environment in which digestive enzymes break down our meals. Water forms the bulk of blood, which allows oxygen and glucose to move around the body, and plays a role in eliminating toxins from the body through urination. Water also helps regulate body temperature. When we're hot, like during a vigorous workout, the capillaries in our skin dilate and sweat glands produce more sweat to dissipate heat. On the other hand, when we're cold, our blood vessels constrict, retaining heat. Water can also help with weight loss and maintaining a healthy body weight. Replacing sweetened drinks with water reduces calorie intake, and drinking water before and during a meal can increase our sense of fullness and prevent overeating. Now, when water losses are greater than the intake, it results in dehydration. There are many causes of dehydration, ranging from vigorous exercise or simply not drinking enough fluids throughout the day to vomiting, diarrhea, excessive sweating, or an inability to swallow. Sometimes dehydration can result from using diuretics or substances like alcohol or certain medications. Dehydration typically causes thirst, dry mouth and lips, nausea, fatigue, and lightheadedness, as well as darkening of the urine color or a decrease in urination. A loss of as little as 2% of our body weight due to water losses can lead to irritability, difficulty concentrating, and headaches. Some groups, like children and the elderly, are at increased risk of dehydration. Compared to adults, children have lower body stores of water to begin with, and they also have a higher surface area to body mass ratio, so they end up losing more water through their skin. And children's thirst sensors are not fully developed, so they are less inclined to drink water. Further, kids often depend on caregivers to provide fluids, which makes it challenging for them to meet their hydration needs. Children between the ages of 4 and 13 need about 1.7 liters of fluid daily, and research shows that well-hydrated children have improved concentration and ability to focus. In fact, studies have shown drinking more water can boost children's school performance. The elderly are also more susceptible to dehydration. Like children, they also have a decreased thirst sensation, and may be taking medications that alter their hydration status, and oftentimes they have chronic diseases that affect their kidneys' abilities to maintain a healthy water balance. There are some circumstances in which a person, regardless of age, might become dehydrated, like traveling on an airplane or during extended strenuous physical activity. Air inside airplanes is drier than the air on the ground, so a flight over 2 hours can lead to dehydration. Drinking fluids before and during a flight can help prevent that. Playing sports or doing heavy physical labor, both of which make us sweat more, can lead to a loss of both water and electrolytes. In the majority of situations, water and electrolyte-containing foods can help replace the losses, but replenishing with an electrolyte-containing drink may help avoid dehydration in longer-duration activities, like running a marathon or working outside in hot weather. Alright, as a quick recap. Most of our water intake comes from fluids, but we can also get some of it from food, and we lose water in a number of ways, such as sweating, breathing, urinating, and defecating, and when those losses are greater than our intake, dehydration can settle in. The first signs of dehydration are a sensation of thirst, dry mouth and lips, dark urine, difficulty concentrating, and irritability. The best way to avoid becoming dehydrated is to monitor your urine color and drink fluids before you get thirsty. Once the thirst sensation is present, dehydration is already underway. Generally, drinking around 2 liters of water per day is recommended, with more likely needed for males, people in dry or hot environments, people who exercise, or people who perform heavy physical labor.